The blood-flecked letter trembled in Ruby Taylor's hands as she stood on the auction block, her wrists raw and burning from the ropes that had bound her for the past 3 days. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly as men in dusty hats and sweat-stained shirts called out bids for her life, her freedom, her very soul. It was 1876, and Ruby had never imagined ending up here, in a rough mining settlement on the edge of nowhere, being sold like cattle to the highest bidder. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Boston, boarding a stagecoach with dreams of a teaching position in San Francisco. Now she was property. $500, shouted a man with yellowed teeth and alcohol on his breath. $600, called another, his eyes roaming her body in a way that made Ruby's skin crawl despite the heat. She tried to stand tall, though exhaustion and fear threatened to buckle her knees. Her once fine traveling dress was torn and filthy, her auburn hair matted with dust. The only possession she had left was the crumpled letter tucked into her bodice, the last words from her father before his death, directing her to the inheritance he'd left for her in California. An inheritance these bandits would never know about, not if she could help it. $750. A new voice cut through the crowd, deep and commanding. The bidding paused as heads turned toward a tall figure at the back of the gathering. Ruby squinted against the sun to make out the newcomer, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hat pulled low over his face. He moved forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to making space for himself in the world. $800, countered the yellow-toothed man, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. $1,000. The newcomer's voice remained steady as he approached the auction block. As he drew closer, Ruby could see him clearly for the first time, a man perhaps 30 years of age, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the Colt revolver at his hip gleamed with care. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $1,000 was a steep price, enough to buy several prime workhorses or a decent stake in a mining claim. "Sold," cried the auctioneer, a weaselly man who'd been eyeing Ruby almost as hungrily as the bidders. "To Mr. Mitchell." The man Mitchell approached the block, his blue eyes meeting Ruby's for the first time. She saw something unexpected there, not the predatory gleam she'd grown to fear, but something harder to define. Determination, perhaps, or anger, though not directed at her. "Get her down from there," Mitchell said to the auctioneer, tossing a leather pouch that clinked heavily with coins. "And get these ropes off her." The auctioneer counted the money quickly, then nodded to his assistant, who roughly pulled Ruby down from the platform. Her legs, weak from standing for hours, nearly gave out beneath her. A strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy now," Mitchell said, his voice lower, meant only for her ears. "Just walk with me." Ruby had no choice but to comply as he led her through the disappointed crowd toward a hitching post where a magnificent chestnut stallion waited. She noticed a badge partially concealed by Mitchell's leather vest, a silver star that caught the sunlight. "You're a lawman," she whispered. "Marshal Mason Mitchell." He didn't look at her as he untied his horse. "And you shouldn't be merchandise." The assistant approached with a bill of sale, which Marshal Mitchell snatched and stuffed into his pocket without looking at it. "Her things." "Ain't got none," the assistant said with a shrug. "She come with just them clothes." Mitchell's jaw tightened as he turned to Ruby. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Ruby answered, though she hadn't been on horseback in years. "Good." He hoisted himself into the saddle, then reached down to help her up behind him. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of her injured wrists. As they rode away from the auction block, Ruby felt the stares of the crowd burning into her back. She knew what they were thinking, that she was just property being transferred from one owner to another. The thought made her stomach churn. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked when they had cleared the edges of the gathering. "Somewhere safe," was all he said, guiding his horse down the town's main street. The settlement was typical of the mining towns that had sprung up across Nevada in recent years, a haphazard collection of wooden buildings in various states of construction and decay. A saloon dominated one corner of the street, its doors already busy despite the early hour. Across from it stood a general store, a small bank, and what appeared to be a doctor's office. Mitchell directed his horse toward a modest building with a sign reading Sheriff's Office. He dismounted and helped Ruby down before tying his horse to the hitching post. "This isn't safe," Ruby protested quietly. "Those men, the ones who took me, they have friends. They'll come looking." Mitchell studied her face. "They probably will, but not here, not yet. Come inside." The sheriff's office was sparsely furnished but clean. A desk sat in one corner, a gun rack on the wall behind it. 3 cells lined the back wall, all empty for now. A pot-bellied stove provided heat, and a coffee pot sat atop it, the aroma of strong brew filling the room. "Sit," Mitchell directed, pulling out a chair next to a small table. Ruby complied, her legs grateful for the reprieve. The marshal disappeared into a back room and returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a small wooden box. "Let me see your wrists." Ruby hesitated, then slowly extended her arms. The ropes had bitten deeply into her flesh, leaving angry red welts that had begun to blister and weep in places. Some areas had cracked and bled, especially where the rough hemp had rubbed against her skin as she had struggled. Mitchell's expression darkened as he gently took her hands and examined the damage. "Bastards," he muttered under his breath. Then, more loudly, "This will sting, but it needs cleaning." He worked methodically, first washing away the dirt and dried blood with water that quickly turned rust-colored. Ruby bit her lip to keep from crying out as the cloth passed over the raw flesh. "How long were you tied?" he asked as he opened the wooden box to reveal various medical supplies. 3 days, I think. I lost count after the first night." His hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. 3 days. Who did this to you? Ruby swallowed hard, the memories rising like bile in her throat. Men who attacked the stagecoach from San Francisco. They killed the driver and the guard. There was another passenger, an older gentleman. They shot him when he tried to fight. Mitchell nodded, his face grim as he applied a salve to her wounds that smelled of herbs and beeswax. "The Blackwell gang. They've been hitting stage coaches all over the territory. You know them." "I've been tracking them for months." He began to wrap clean bandages around her wrists, his touch unexpectedly gentle for such large hands. "They usually steal the valuables and leave survivors. Taking hostages is new." Ruby looked down at her bandaged wrists. "I don't think it was planned. One of them, the leader, he saw something about me that." She trailed off, unable to continue. Mitchell finished bandaging her right wrist and moved to the left. "You don't have to talk about it now." A silence fell between them as he completed his task. When he finished, he poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and placed it before her, along with a plate that held bread and a chunk of cheese. "Eat," he said. "You look half-starved." Ruby hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food appeared before her. She ate quickly, almost embarrassed by her lack of decorum, but the marshal didn't seem to notice or care. He busied himself at his desk, writing something in a ledger. "Thank you," she said when she had finished. "For the food and for—" She gestured vaguely at her bandaged wrists and the room around them. Mitchell looked up from his writing. "Don't thank me. What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. I'm just doing my job." Your job doesn't include spending $1,000 to buy people at auction." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That wasn't official business. Then why? He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Because I've been after the Blackwell gang for 8 months. They've killed 12 people that I know of. Robbed stagecoaches, trains, lone travelers. But selling people, that's a new low even for them." His eyes held hers. "You're not just a victim, Miss Taylor, Ruby Taylor, Miss Taylor. You're a witness, and I aim to bring them to justice." Ruby's heart sank. So that was it. She was just a means to an end, a way to catch criminals. She shouldn't have expected anything else, of course. Why would this man care about her beyond her usefulness to his cause? As if reading her thoughts, Mitchell continued, "But more than that, you're a person who's been wronged. And I swore an oath to protect people from men like Blackwell." He stood and crossed to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal an assortment of guns. He selected a small revolver and checked it before approaching her. "You know how to use one of these?" Ruby shook her head. "I'll teach you. Until Blackwell and his men are behind bars or in the ground, you're in danger. I can't be with you every moment." "Where will I go?" Ruby asked, suddenly realizing the precariousness of her position. "I have no money, no possessions. I know a place. A widow named Mrs. Finch runs a boarding house on the edge of town. Good woman, discreet. She'll take you in, no questions asked." He hesitated, then added, "I'll cover the cost for now." "I can't accept that." "You can and you will," Mitchell said firmly. "Consider it an advance on the reward money you'll get when we catch Blackwell." Ruby wanted to argue further but found she lacked the energy. The events of the past days were catching up to her, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Mitchell noticed her fatigue. "You need rest. I'll take you to Mrs. Finch's now. We can talk more tomorrow." As they prepared to leave, the door to the sheriff's office burst open. A young man stood in the doorway, breathless and wild-eyed. "Marshal, there's been another robbery out at Peterson's ranch. 3 men masked. They took everything of value and shot Peterson when he tried to stop them." Mitchell's expression hardened. "Peterson alive?" "Barely. Doc's with him now." The marshal turned to Ruby, conflict evident in his eyes. "I have to go." "I understand," she said, though fear crept back into her heart at the thought of being left alone. Mitchell seemed to hesitate, then made a decision. He removed his badge and pinned it to the inside of her torn sleeve, hidden from view. "Show this to Mrs. Finch. Tell her I sent you and that I'll be by later to explain. She'll understand." He pressed the small revolver into her hand. "Keep this close. Don't use it unless you have to, but if you do, aim for the center," Ruby finished for him, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. A flicker of approval crossed his face. "Smart woman. The boarding house is 3 blocks east, white house with blue shutters. Can't miss it." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Miss Taylor?" "Yes." His blue eyes held hers with fierce intensity. "I swear to you, as long as I'm alive, no one will ever put ropes on your wrists again." Then he was gone, leaving Ruby standing in the sheriff's office, a gun in her hand and a promise ringing in her ears. The walk to Mrs. Finch's boarding house was mercifully short. Ruby kept her head down, the revolver concealed in the folds of her tattered dress, her bandaged wrists hidden as best she could manage. Even so, she felt the stares of townspeople as she passed, some curious, some pitying, some openly hostile. Word traveled fast in small towns, and she had no doubt that everyone knew she'd been on the auction block that morning. The boarding house was exactly as Marshal Mitchell had described it, a 2-story white clapboard structure with cheerful blue shutters and a well-tended garden. It stood slightly apart from the other buildings, at the eastern edge of town, where the dusty street began to give way to open country. Ruby hesitated at the gate, suddenly aware of her appearance, dirty, disheveled, looking every bit the vagrant. Before she could summon the courage to approach, the front door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch. "Are you going to stand there all day, or are you coming in?" The woman's voice was brisk but not unkind. Startled, Ruby pushed open the gate and approached the house. As she drew closer, she could see that Mrs. Finch was perhaps in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a neat bun and keen eyes that missed nothing. "Marshal Mitchell sent me," Ruby said, her voice cracking with fatigue and nervousness. "Mrs. Finch's gaze swept over Ruby, taking in her condition with a practiced eye. "Of course he did. That man has a habit of finding strays." Despite her words, there was fondness in her tone. "Come inside before you fall down, girl." The interior of the boarding house was clean and welcoming, with polished wooden floors and simple but comfortable furnishings. A delicious smell wafted from what Ruby assumed was the kitchen, something savory and homey that made her stomach rumble despite the bread and cheese she'd eaten earlier. "Marshal Mitchell said to show you this," Ruby said, carefully unpinning the badge from inside her sleeve. Mrs. Finch barely glanced at it. "Mace doesn't part with that badge for just anyone. You must be in real trouble." "No need to explain, not to me anyway." Mrs. Finch led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor. "Whatever your story is, it can wait until you've bathed and rested." She opened a door to reveal a small but tidy bedroom. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, beside a washstand with a pitcher and basin. A simple wooden wardrobe and a rocking chair completed the furnishings. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. I'll bring up hot water for your bath and see if I can find you some clean clothes." Mrs. Finch turned to leave, then paused, her eyes falling on Ruby's bandaged wrists. Her expression softened. "Those need changing before you sleep. I'll bring fresh bandages too." Before Ruby could thank her, the older woman was gone, her footsteps retreating down the hallway. Left alone, Ruby sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day of the past week finally catching up with her. Tears she had refused to shed in front of her captors, in front of the leering crowd, even in front of the marshal, now flowed freely down her cheeks. She was alive. She was safe, at least for the moment. But her world had been shattered, her plans destroyed. The teaching position in San Francisco was surely filled by now. The inheritance her father had left her, the deed to a small property just outside the city, might as well be on the moon for all the good it did her now. Ruby was still sitting there, lost in her thoughts, when Mrs. Finch returned with another woman carrying buckets of steaming water. They filled a copper tub in the bathroom, and Mrs. Finch provided soap, towels, and a clean nightgown and robe. "These were my daughters," she explained. "She's married and living in Sacramento now. They might be a bit big, but they'll do until we can get you something better." The bath was bliss. Ruby soaked until the water cooled, washing away days of dirt, fear, and humiliation. The soap smelled of lavender and chamomile, soothing her raw nerves almost as much as it cleansed her skin. When she emerged, dressed in the borrowed nightgown, Mrs. Finch was waiting to rebandage her wrists. The older woman worked efficiently, making no comment about the ugly wounds except to mutter, "Animals," under her breath. "Why are you helping me?" Ruby asked as Mrs. Finch tied off the final bandage. "You don't know anything about me." Mrs. Finch met her gaze steadily. "I know Mason Mitchell. If he sent you here, that's good enough for me." She stood, gathering the used bandages. "Get some rest now. There's food when you wake up, and we can talk then if you'd like." Ruby barely managed to thank her before sleep claimed her, deeper and more peaceful than she would have thought possible given the circumstances. She woke to darkness and confusion, momentarily panicked until she remembered where she was. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the unfamiliar room. Something had woken her a sound, voices downstairs. One of them belonged to Mrs. Finch and the other, Marshal Mitchell. Ruby slipped from the bed and pulled on the borrowed robe. She shouldn't eavesdrop, she knew, but curiosity and a need to understand her situation drove her to the door. Opening it a crack, she could hear their conversation more clearly. Dangerous, Mace. Not just for her, but for anyone sheltering her. I know, Evelyn. I wouldn't have brought her here if I had any other choice. I'm not complaining. Lord knows that girl needed help if what I've heard is true, but Blackwell isn't a man to cross. Blackwell isn't a man at all. He's vermin, and I aim to exterminate him. A sigh from Mrs. Finch. Your father used to talk the same way. Look where it got him. My father died doing what was right, and left a wife and son to mourn him. Is that what you want? A long silence followed, broken at last by the marshal. Peterson died an hour ago. That makes 13 that Blackwell's responsible for. 13 that I know of. I'm sorry to hear about Peterson. He was a good man. Another pause. What's the girl's story? Her name is Ruby Taylor, school teacher from Boston on her way to San Francisco for a position. Blackwell's men attacked her stagecoach, killed everyone else. They kept her for 3 days before bringing her to the auction. Dear God, did they? I don't think so, not based on what she's told me, but 3 days is a long time and she hasn't said much. Ruby's stomach clenched at the implication. No, they hadn't violated her in that way, though the threat had hung over her constantly. It had been their leader Blackwell himself who had stopped the others, saying she'd fetch a better price undamaged. Small mercy that. What's your plan, Mace? Mrs. Finch asked. Keep her safe until I can get Blackwell. The circuit judge will be here in 2 weeks if I can catch him by then. And if you can't, then I'll arrange for her passage to San Francisco or wherever she wants to go. With what money? You've spent nearly everything you have on buying her freedom. Mitchell's voice hardened. It was worth it. I'm not saying it wasn't, but you can't save everyone, Mace. I don't need to save everyone, just her. Something in his tone made Ruby's heart beat faster. There was more than duty in that voice, something personal, something almost fierce. You barely know her, Mrs. Finch said, echoing Ruby's thoughts. I know enough. The scrape of a chair indicated Mitchell was standing. I should go. I've got men watching the roads, but Blackwell could still slip through. Will you keep her here? Of course. But be careful, Mace. That girl up there has already lost too much. Don't make her watch you die, too. I don't plan on dying, Evelyn. Neither did your father. Ruby quietly closed her door and returned to bed, her mind racing. She had suspected the marshal's interest in her was purely professional, a means to catch Blackwell. But his conversation with Mrs. Finch suggested something more complex, and he'd spent all his money to buy her freedom. Sleep eluded her for a long time as she pondered these revelations and what they might mean for her future. The next morning, Ruby dressed in clothes Mrs. Finch had found for her, a simple blue cotton dress, slightly faded but clean and well mended. It hung a bit loosely on her frame, but after tightening the laces, it fit well enough. She found Mrs. Finch in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. 2 other women sat at the table, eating breakfast. They looked up curiously as Ruby entered. Good morning, Mrs. Finch said. Feeling better after some rest? Much, thank you. Ruby hesitated in the doorway, unsure of her welcome among the other boarders. Don't stand on ceremony, come eat. Mrs. Finch gestured to an empty chair. This is Mrs. Cooper and Miss Johnson. Ladies, this is Miss Taylor. She'll be staying with us for a while. The introductions were polite if somewhat reserved. Ruby sensed the other women had questions but were too well-mannered to ask them directly. Instead, they made small talk about the weather and town gossip as Ruby ate a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. After breakfast, Mrs. Finch showed Ruby around the house and the small garden behind it. "You're welcome to help with chores if you'd like," she said. "Keeps the hands and mind occupied." Ruby was grateful for the distraction. She spent the morning helping in the garden, finding a measure of peace in the simple act of pulling weeds and watering plants. The physical activity was therapeutic, though her bandaged wrists limited what she could do. It was nearly noon when Marshal Mitchell arrived. Ruby was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Finch prepare lunch when she heard the knock at the door. "That'll be Mace," Mrs. Finch said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Right on time." Ruby's pulse quickened at the sound of his voice in the hallway. A moment later he appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept, but his gaze sharpened when it fell on Ruby. "Miss Taylor, you're looking better." "Thank you, Marshal, I'm feeling better." Mrs. Finch looked between them, a knowing expression on her face. "I'll leave you two to talk. Lunch will be ready in half an hour, Mace, if you'd like to stay." When she had gone, an awkward silence descended. Ruby was acutely aware of her borrowed dress, her bandaged wrists, her uncertain position. "How are you, really?" Mitchell asked, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. "I'm surviving," Ruby answered honestly. "Your friend has been very kind. Evelyn's good people, known her since I was a boy." He set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I came to check on you and to give you these." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth bag. "Found them at the pawn shop in town. Man said they were brought in yesterday by a stranger." Curious, Ruby opened the bag. Inside were her father's pocket watch, a small silver locket containing a miniature portrait of her mother, and the tortoiseshell combs she'd worn in her hair the day the stagecoach was attacked. Tears sprang to her eyes as she touched these fragments of her former life. "How did you know they were mine?" The watch has initials engraved inside the cover. "RT. I took a chance they belonged to you." "They were my father's," Ruby said, opening the watch to reveal the inscription inside. "Robert Taylor, with love from E." Her mother's gift to her father on their wedding day. "These were the only valuables I had with me. I thought they were gone forever." The pawnbroker was reluctant to part with them, but he became more cooperative when I explained the situation. A grim smile touched Mitchell's lips. "And when I mentioned obstruction of justice charges." "Thank you," Ruby said, closing her hand around the precious items. "I can't repay you, don't need repayment. Just doing my job." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "There's something else we need to discuss." "About Blackwell." Ruby tensed. "Have you found him?" "Not yet, but we will." Mitchell leaned against the doorframe, his expression serious. "I need to ask you some questions about your time with them. I know it's difficult, but anything you can tell me might help." Ruby nodded, steeling herself. "What do you want to know? How many men were in the gang? Did you hear any names, see any faces clearly?" "There were 6 of them during the stagecoach robbery. The leader Blackwell and 5 others. They called one of them Doc, though he wasn't any kind of doctor I'd trust. Another was Holt." "I didn't catch the others' names." Mitchell nodded, his expression intent. "Would you recognize them if you saw them again?" "Yes. They wore bandanas during the robbery, but afterward." Ruby swallowed hard, pushing away the memories of those terrifying days. "Afterward, they didn't bother hiding their faces." "Can you describe Blackwell?" "Tall, taller than you even. Dark hair streaked with gray. A scar here." She traced a line from her left eyebrow down her cheek. "His eyes were strange, different colors. One blue, one almost green." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "That's him all right. Anything else you remember? Conversations, plans they might have mentioned?" Ruby closed her eyes, trying to recall details from her captivity. "They argued about what to do with me. Some wanted to use me and leave me like the others." Her voice faltered, but she pushed on. "Blackwell said I'd fetch a good price in Humboldt. said he had a buyer lined up who'd pay extra for an educated woman with fine manners. A buyer, he mentioned a specific person, no name. Just that there was a man in town who collected special merchandise. Those were his words. Mitchell's expression darkened. That suggests Blackwell has connections in Humboldt, someone working with him. He straightened, a new urgency in his manner. Miss Taylor, I don't want to frighten you, but if Blackwell has partners in town, this place may not be as safe as I thought. Fear, which had receded somewhat during her time at Mrs. Finch's, came flooding back. What should I do? For now, stay here. Don't go into town alone. Keep that revolver close. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to post a deputy here just as a precaution. Won't that draw attention? If someone in town is working with Blackwell. You have a point. Mitchell frowned, considering. Blackwell doesn't know I bought you. The auction was handled by Jones, who's just a hired gun with no loyalty to anyone. As far as Blackwell knows, you could have been purchased by any of a dozen men there. But people in town saw me with you. They'll talk. They already have, I'm sure. Mitchell's blue eyes met hers. There's another option, but you may not like it. What is it? We could use you as bait. Let word spread that you're here staying at Mrs. Finch's. See if Blackwell or his men make a move to reclaim their property. Ruby felt her blood run cold at the thought, but she forced herself to consider it rationally. You'd catch them. We'd be ready. I have deputies I trust. We'd keep you safe. And if something went wrong, Mitchell's gaze didn't waver. I made you a promise, Miss Taylor. No one will put ropes on your wrists again while I'm alive. Ruby studied him. This man who had spent his life savings to free her, who had sworn to protect her though she was nothing to him but a stranger and a witness. There was something in his steady gaze that inspired confidence, a certainty, a solidity that had been lacking in her life even before the stagecoach robbery. I'll do it, she said finally. I'll help you catch Blackwell. Relief and something like admiration flashed across Mitchell's face. You're a brave woman, Ruby Taylor. The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her. Not brave, just tired of being afraid. Mrs. Finch returned then, announcing that lunch was ready. As they ate, Mitchell explained the plan. They would let it be known that Ruby was staying at the boarding house, recovering from her ordeal. Mitchell would make a show of leaving town on business, giving Blackwell's men the impression that Ruby was vulnerable. In reality, I'll be right here along with deputies hidden around the property, Mitchell explained. Mrs. Finch, I hate to involve you in this. Nonsense, the older woman said briskly. This is my home, and no gang of outlaws is going to threaten me or anyone under my roof. She turned to Ruby. Besides, it's time someone stood up to Blackwell. Too many in this town look the other way because they're scared. The plan was set in motion that very afternoon. Mitchell escorted Ruby to the general store, ostensibly to purchase some necessities, but really to be seen in town. They made a point of speaking just loudly enough to be overheard, with Mitchell mentioning that he had to ride to Carson City the next day on business. Will you be all right here with Mrs. Finch? He asked as they walked back to the boarding house, several pairs of curious eyes following their progress. I'll manage, Ruby replied, playing her part. How long will you be gone? 3 days at most. Try to stay out of trouble until I get back. The performance continued back at the boarding house, where Mitchell made a show of giving instructions to Mrs. Finch about keeping Ruby safe in his absence. Then, as dusk fell, he mounted his horse and rode ostentatiously out of town, watched by many of the townsfolk. What the onlookers didn't see was Mitchell circling back an hour later, approaching the boarding house from the back, where the darkness and the trees provided cover. He slipped inside through the kitchen door, where Mrs. Finch was waiting. Any sign of trouble? He asked in a low voice. Not yet. But there will be. She handed him a cup of coffee. "I've prepared the root cellar as you asked. It has a good view of the back of the house, and no one will think to look there." Two deputies had already taken up positions, one in the stable behind the property, another in a vacant house across the street. Ruby, despite her fear, felt a grim satisfaction in being part of the trap rather than merely its victim. That night, Ruby lay awake in her bed, the revolver Mitchell had given her under her pillow. The house was quiet, Mrs. Finch and the other boarders having retired hours ago. Mitchell was in the root cellar, keeping watch over the property. Knowing he was near should have been comforting, but Ruby found it difficult to relax. Every creak of the house settling made her tense. Every rustle of the wind through the trees outside her window sounded like approaching footsteps. The memory of rough hands and scratchy ropes was too fresh, the fear too deeply ingrained to be easily dismissed. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. Dreams came, fragmented, chaotic visions of the stagecoach attack, of being bound and dragged through the desert, of standing on the auction block. In her dream, Mitchell wasn't there to save her. Instead, Blackwell himself bought her, his mismatched eyes gleaming with triumph as he dragged her away. Ruby woke with a start, heart pounding, to find her room bathed in moonlight. For a moment, disoriented by the dream, she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality reasserted itself. She was at Mrs. Finch's boarding house, part of a plan to catch Blackwell. She was about to lie back down when she heard a soft scraping sound from outside. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something or someone was at her window. Ruby reached under her pillow for the revolver, her fingers closing around the grip as the window began to slide slowly upward. She sat up, pointing the gun at the opening just as a dark figure started to climb through. "Don't move," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will shoot." The figure froze halfway through the window. "Now, that ain't no way to greet an old friend," came a familiar voice that sent ice through Ruby's veins. Doc, the man who had tied the ropes around her wrists, who had laughed as she cried out in pain. One of Blackwell's most loyal men. "Back out slowly," Ruby commanded, the gun unwavering in her hands despite her racing heart. "Don't think I will," Doc replied, and suddenly lunged forward, faster than Ruby had anticipated. She pulled the trigger. The gun's report was deafening in the small room. Doc fell backward with a surprised grunt, tumbling out the window to the ground below. Immediately, shouts erupted outside. The sound of running footsteps filled the house as Mrs. Finch and the other boarders were awakened by the gunshot. Ruby's door burst open and Mitchell appeared, his own gun drawn. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, quickly scanning the room. "No, I'm fine. It was Doc, one of Blackwell's men. He tried to come through the window. I shot him." Mitchell crossed to the window and looked out. "He's down there, not moving." He turned back to Ruby, an expression of approval and concern mingling on his face. "You did good." Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, a shotgun in her hands. "Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Mitchell assured her, "but we need to secure the house. Where are the other boarders?" "In the parlor, scared half to death." "Keep them there." "Deputy Wilson," Mitchell called out the window to one of his men, "check the man down there, then search the perimeter. There may be others." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Mitchell insisted on checking every room in the house, every closet and hiding place, while his deputies secured the grounds. Ruby stayed with Mrs. Finch and the other women in the parlor, the revolver still clutched in her hand. Deputy Wilson eventually reported that Doc was dead, shot through the chest. There was no sign of any other intruders, though they found evidence that at least 2 horses had been tethered in the woods behind the property. "They'll be reporting back to Blackwell," Mitchell said grimly when he rejoined them in the parlor. He'll know his man failed. Will he try again? Ruby asked. Maybe, but not tonight and not here. He's too careful for that. Mitchell turned to the frightened boarders. Ladies, I apologize for the disturbance. This house is secure now, but I understand if you'd prefer to seek accommodation elsewhere for a few days. Mrs. Cooper and Miss Johnson exchanged glances, then Mrs. Cooper spoke. I have a sister in Carson City. I think I'll visit her for a while. I'll arrange for someone to escort you there safely in the morning, Mitchell promised. When the other women had returned to their rooms to pack, Mitchell, Ruby, and Mrs. Finch remained in the parlor, discussing their next move. Blackwell knows you're here now, Mitchell said to Ruby. And he knows you're armed and willing to defend yourself. That changes things. How so? Ruby asked. He'll be more careful, more thorough in his planning. Mitchell's expression was grim, and he'll want revenge for Doc. So what do we do? Mrs. Finch asked. Mitchell considered for a moment. We change tactics. Ruby can't stay here now. It's too obvious a target. We need somewhere Blackwell wouldn't think to look. Where? Ruby asked. My place, Mitchell said. It's a small cabin outside of town. Remote, defensible, and few people even know it exists. Isn't that too obvious, Mrs. Finch objected. You're the marshal. He'd expect her to be with you. Not if he thinks I'm still in Carson City. As far as anyone knows, I left town this evening and won't be back for days. Mitchell turned to Ruby. It's not as comfortable as Mrs. Finch's, but it's safe. Ruby thought about it. The prospect of staying alone with Marshal Mitchell in his cabin raised questions of propriety, but such concerns seemed trivial compared to the very real danger she faced. When would we go? She asked. Tonight. Now, while it's still dark and Blackwell's men are regrouping. Ruby nodded. I'll get my things. Within half an hour, Ruby had packed her few possessions, the clothes Mrs. Finch had given her, the personal items Mitchell had recovered from the pawn shop, and the revolver that had already saved her life once. Mitchell brought his horse to the back door, away from prying eyes. I've arranged for deputies to watch over Mrs. Finch and escort the other boarders safely out of town, he told Ruby as he helped her mount. Deputy Wilson will spread the word that you fled town after tonight's incident. Hopefully, that will buy us some time. Ruby settled behind Mitchell on the horse, acutely aware of his solid presence as she wrapped her arms around his waist for balance. They set off into the darkness, avoiding the main roads and instead taking a winding path through the scrubland that surrounded Humboldt. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. Under different circumstances, Ruby might have found the ride romantic, the moonlight, the rhythm of the horse beneath them, the warmth of Mitchell's body against the chill night air. But fear and uncertainty cast a shadow over such thoughts. After riding for nearly an hour, they approached a small cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. It was simple but solidly built, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a well-tended vegetable garden was visible in the moonlight. It's not much, Mitchell said as he helped Ruby dismount, but it's home. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a comfortable-looking armchair beside it. A table and 2 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area, and a curtain separated the main room from what Ruby presumed was the bedroom. Mitchell lit a lamp, casting a warm glow over the space. Make yourself comfortable. I'll get a fire going. As he busied himself with the fireplace, Ruby took in her surroundings more fully. The cabin was neat and functional, with few personal touches, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a guitar leaning in one corner, a framed photograph on the mantel that she couldn't make out clearly from where she stood. You live here alone? She asked, setting her small bag on the table. Just me, Mitchell confirmed, coaxing flames from the kindling he'd arranged. "Been here about 5 years now." "It's nice," Ruby said and meant it. The cabin had a solidity to it, a sense of permanence that matched its owner. Mitchell straightened, the fire now crackling merrily. "You can take the bedroom, I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't put you out of your bed, it's no hardship. I've slept in worse places." His tone brooked no argument. "Are you hungry? I don't have much, but there's bread and some stew I can heat up." They ate a simple meal at the table, both too tired for much conversation. Afterward, Mitchell showed Ruby to the bedroom, which was as spare and functional as the rest of the cabin, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a washstand. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up," he said. "If you need anything in the night, don't hesitate to call." "Thank you, Marshal," Ruby said softly, "for everything." Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth, a softening. "Mason," he said. "My name is Mason." "Mason," she repeated, and the name felt right on her lips. He nodded once, then left her to her privacy, pulling the curtain closed behind him. Ruby changed into the nightgown Mrs. Finch had given her and washed her face in the cool water from the pitcher. Her bandaged wrists were beginning to itch as they healed, a discomfort she welcomed as a sign of recovery. She sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion pulling at her limbs but her mind still too active for sleep. The events of the evening shooting Doc, fleeing to Mason's cabin, seemed surreal, like something from a dime novel rather than her real life. What would happen tomorrow? And the day after that? How long could she remain in hiding, waiting for Blackwell to make his move? And what about her plans, her future? The teaching position in San Francisco was surely lost to her now. Her father's inheritance, would she ever claim it? Or was her life forever altered by the events of the past week? These questions circled in Ruby's mind as she lay down and pulled the quilt over her. The bed smelled faintly of soap and something distinctly masculine, Mason's scent. It was oddly comforting, like being wrapped in his protection even as he slept in the other room. Despite her racing thoughts, the day's emotional and physical toll eventually claimed her, and Ruby drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight filtering through a small window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her still sleepy mind. Then memory returned: the shooting, the midnight ride, Mason's cabin. Ruby rose and dressed quickly in one of the simple dresses Mrs. Finch had provided. She combed her hair with her fingers as best she could and tidied the bed before pushing aside the curtain that separated the bedroom from the main living area. Mason stood at the small stove, his back to her. He'd changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was damp, suggesting he'd already washed up. Something about the domesticity of the scene, this strong, dangerous man making breakfast in his humble cabin, touched Ruby unexpectedly. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, and the smile that crossed his face at the sight of her sent a flutter through Ruby's chest. "Morning. Sleep well." "Better than I expected to," she admitted, crossing to the table. "Any news from town?" "Deputy Wilson rode out at dawn. Mrs. Finch is fine. Mrs. Cooper and Miss Johnson left for Carson City with an escort." He poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one before her. "And word is spreading that you fled Humboldt after the shooting. You think Blackwell will believe it?" Mason leaned against the counter, considering. "Hard to say. He's cautious, which has kept him alive this long. He might send men to verify before he makes his next move." "What is our next move?" Ruby asked, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "We wait," Mason said simply. "Blackwell wants you badly enough to send men after you. He'll make another attempt. When he does, we'll be ready. And in the meantime, we keep you safe and comfortable." He turned back to the stove, where a pan of eggs was cooking. I hope you like your eggs scrambled. It's about the only way I know how to make them." They ate breakfast together, the conversation turning to less urgent matters. Ruby asked about Mason's background, how he had become a marshal, how long he'd been in Humboldt. He told her about growing up in Nevada, the son of a lawman who had been killed in the line of duty when Mason was just 16. "My father believed in justice above all else," Mason said, a faraway look in his eyes. "He died protecting a Chinese immigrant who was being harassed by local toughs. The toughs worked for a powerful man in town who didn't appreciate the interference." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. "That must have been difficult for you and your mother." "It was. We moved to Carson City after that. My mother took in sewing to support us." A small smile touched his lips. "She's remarried now to a good man who owns a mercantile there. And you became a lawman like your father." Mason nodded. "Seemed like the right thing to do. The only thing, really." Ruby understood. Her own career choice had been similarly influenced by her parents, her father a professor of literature, her mother a teacher before her marriage. Education and learning had been valued above all else in their household. "What about you?" Mason asked. "How does a Boston schoolteacher end up on a stagecoach to San Francisco?" Ruby hesitated, then decided there was no reason not to tell him the truth. "My father died last year. He left me a small property near San Francisco, a house with a bit of land. I secured a teaching position there and was on my way to start a new life when—" She trailed off, the memory of the stagecoach attack still too painful. "I'm sorry about your father," Mason said. "And about what happened to you. No one should have to endure what you did." "I survived," Ruby said simply. "Many didn't." A comfortable silence fell between them. After breakfast, Mason showed Ruby around the property, the vegetable garden he maintained, the small stream that provided fresh water, the corral where his horse now grazed contentedly. "It's peaceful here," Ruby observed, taking in the sweeping vista of hills and valleys that surrounded the cabin. "I can see why you chose this spot." "It's a good place to think," Mason agreed. "After a day of dealing with the troubles in town, it's nice to come back to somewhere quiet." As they walked back to the cabin, Ruby noticed Mason's hand drift to his holster, his eyes scanning the horizon. Despite the peace of the moment, he remained vigilant. It was a reminder that their situation was far from resolved, that danger could appear at any moment. "You think we're safe here?" she asked as they reached the porch. Mason considered the question. "Safer than in town. But nowhere is completely safe until Blackwell is caught or killed." "That's not very reassuring." A smile touched his lips. "I never was good at reassurance, but I am good at my job." His blue eyes met hers, steady and certain. "And my job right now is keeping you safe." The days fell into a pattern. Mason would ride into town each morning, ostensibly returning from Carson City, to maintain the fiction that Ruby had fled. He would gather information, confer with his deputies, and return to the cabin by midday. Afternoons were spent teaching Ruby more about handling the revolver, improving her aim and confidence with the weapon. "You're a natural," Mason observed on the third day as Ruby hit the makeshift target. "A tin can set on a fence post 3 times in a row. Most folks take weeks to develop that kind of accuracy." Ruby lowered the gun, pleased with the praise but troubled by the necessity behind it. "I never thought I'd become proficient with firearms. My father would be scandalized." "Your father might feel differently if he knew the circumstances," Mason replied, retrieving the can to set it up again. "There's nothing wrong with being able to defend yourself." In the evenings, they would share a meal that they prepared together, then sit by the fire. Mason had a small collection of books, and sometimes Ruby would read aloud while he cleaned his guns or mended tack. Other times, They simply talked, sharing stories of their lives before their paths crossed. Ruby found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, steady man. There was a depth to him that belied his sometimes gruff exterior and intelligence, a thoughtfulness that emerged in their conversations by the fire. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. On the fourth night, as they sat before the fire, Ruby finally asked the question that had been on her mind since that first day. "Why did you do it? Spend all your money to buy me at that auction?" Mason was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. Just when Ruby thought he might not answer, he spoke. "When I was a boy, after my father died, my mother and I were struggling. There was a time when we had nothing, no food, no money for rent. A man in Carson City offered my mother a position in his establishment." His voice was flat, emotionless. "It wasn't the kind of work any decent woman would choose, but she was desperate. For me." Ruby's heart contracted with understanding and sorrow. "What happened?" The sheriff's wife found out. "She offered my mother work as a seamstress instead, took us in until we got on our feet." He finally looked up from the fire, his blue eyes intense in the flickering light. "When I saw you on that auction block, with those rope burns on your wrists, all I could think was that no one had been there to help my mother when she needed it most. But someone had stepped in before it was too late. I wanted to do the same for you." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes at the simple, heartfelt explanation. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Mason shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me for basic human decency." "It was far more than decency," Ruby insisted. "You spent everything you had for a stranger." A smile touched his lips. "Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit foolish." "Not foolish," Ruby said softly. "Heroic." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something shifted in the air, a tension, a possibility that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, unacknowledged. Mason cleared his throat and looked away first. "It's getting late. We should turn in." That night, Ruby lay awake in Mason's bed, listening to him moving about in the main room as he settled on the pallet by the fire. Their conversation had revealed a new dimension to this man who had saved her, a history of hardship that had shaped his strong sense of justice, his compassion for those in vulnerable positions. She found herself wondering what it would be like to stay here in this peaceful place with this good man. To build a life away from the memories of Boston and the shattered dreams of San Francisco. It was a dangerous line of thinking, she knew. Mason had a duty to protect her, nothing more. Once Blackwell was caught, their paths would likely diverge. Yet the thought of leaving, of never seeing Mason again after this was over, caused an unexpected ache in her chest. The next morning, as they ate breakfast, Mason seemed preoccupied, his usual alertness tempered by some internal concern. "Is something wrong?" Ruby finally asked. He looked up from his coffee. "Just thinking. It's been 5 days since Doc tried to take you from Mrs. Finch's. No sign of Blackwell or his men since then." "Isn't that good news?" "It's unusual," Mason said, his brow furrowed. "Blackwell isn't known for his patience. By now, I'd have expected another attempt, or at least some probing of our defenses. Maybe he believes I've truly fled Humboldt. Maybe." But Mason didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe he's planning something bigger than we anticipated." A chill ran down Ruby's spine at the thought. "What should we do?" "I'm going to ride into town earlier today, talk to my deputies, see if there's any news." Mason stood, collecting their breakfast dishes. "Stay inside while I'm gone, keep the doors locked and the revolver close." After Mason left, Ruby busied herself with chores around the cabin, washing the dishes, sweeping the floor, tidying the already neat space. It was hard not to worry about what Blackwell might be planning, but she refused to give in to fear. She had survived so much already. She would survive this too. Around noon, Ruby was hanging freshly washed linens on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of approaching horses. More than one, from the sound of it. Her heart leaped with hope Mason returning with his deputies. Perhaps then plummeted as she realized Mason would have called out to alert her of his approach. Ruby abandoned the laundry and ran for the cabin, her only thought to reach the revolver Mason had left for her on the table. She was halfway to the door when 3 riders came around the side of the cabin, cutting off her path. "Well, well, look what we found," drawled a familiar voice that turned Ruby's blood to ice. Blackwell himself sat atop a large black horse, flanked by 2 of his men. His mismatched eyes glittered with malice as they fell on Ruby, and the scar that ran down his face seemed to deepen as he smiled. "Miss me, teacher?" Blackwell asked, dismounting with fluid grace despite his size. The other men followed suit, spreading out to block any chance of escape. Ruby backed away, her mind racing. The revolver was inside, out of reach. The nearest weapon was a clothespin in her hand, useless against 3 armed men. "Marshal Mitchell will be back any minute," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "With his deputies." Blackwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "No, he won't. Mitchell's busy in town right now dealing with a little distraction we arranged." He took a step toward her. "A fire at the livery stable. Tragic. All those horses." Horror filled Ruby at the thought of innocent animals suffering, of people in town endangered, all to lure Mason away from the cabin. "What do you want?" she demanded, though she knew the answer. "You know what I want." Blackwell's voice hardened. "You were promised to a buyer, a very important man who paid good money in advance, and you killed one of my best men." He drew a coil of rope from his saddlebag. "So now you're coming with me, and this time there won't be any heroic marshal to save you." Ruby glanced around desperately for some means of escape or defense. The clothesline. Perhaps she could use it somehow. But before she could act, one of Blackwell's men moved with surprising speed, grabbing her from behind. She struggled fiercely, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. "Feisty," Blackwell commented, approaching with the rope. "The buyer will enjoy breaking that spirit." Ruby continued to fight as Blackwell bound her wrists, the rough hemp biting into her barely healed skin. "Mason will find me," she said through clenched teeth. "He'll kill you for this." Something dark flashed in Blackwell's eyes. "Mitchell, he's a dead man already, just doesn't know it yet." He tightened the ropes with deliberate cruelty, making Ruby gasp in pain. "By the time he figures out what's happened, you'll be long gone and I'll be waiting for him." Fear for Mason mixed with Ruby's terror for herself. Blackwell's plan was clear: use her as bait to lure Mason into a trap. And it would work. She knew it would. Mason would come for her, regardless of the danger to himself. "No one's coming to save you, teacher," Blackwell said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not this time." They forced her onto one of the horses, her bound wrists making it difficult to maintain her balance. As they rode away from the cabin, Ruby twisted to look back, hoping against hope to see Mason returning. But the trail behind them remained empty, the cabin growing smaller in the distance until it disappeared from view altogether. They rode for hours, following a winding path through the hills that seemed designed to confuse any potential pursuers. Ruby tried to memorize landmarks to keep track of their direction, but Blackwell's men kept her horse between theirs, limiting her view. The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached their destination, a dilapidated mining camp nestled in a narrow valley. Several small cabins and a larger structure that might once have been an assay office stood in various states of disrepair. 3 more men lounged outside one of the cabins, playing cards on an upturned barrel. They looked up as the riders approached. "Got her, boss," one called. Blackwell dismounted and pulled Ruby roughly from her horse. "Got her. Any trouble in town?" "Nope. Fire worked perfect. Whole town still putting it out. Marshal and his men are right in the middle of it." Ruby felt sick at the confirmation that Mason had been drawn into Blackwell's diversion. She prayed no one had been hurt in the fire, but knowing Blackwell causing harm was likely part of the plan. "Put her in the office," Blackwell ordered, shoving Ruby toward one of his men. "And make sure she's secure. I don't want any surprises when Mitchell shows up." "You think he'll track us here?" the man asked, gripping Ruby's arm painfully tight. Blackwell's scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. "I'm counting on it. I left him a clear enough trail. By morning, he'll be riding right into our little welcome party." Ruby was led to the larger building and thrust inside. It was a single room, stripped of anything valuable long ago. Dust covered the wooden floor and cobwebs hung from the rafters. The windows were boarded up, leaving only thin strips of fading daylight to illuminate the space. "Sit," her guard commanded, pushing her toward a chair in the center of the room, the only piece of furniture remaining. Ruby sat, her bound wrists throbbing. The guard produced more rope and secured her to the chair, wrapping coils around her torso and ankles until she could barely move. "Comfortable?" he sneered when he was done. Ruby didn't dignify the question with a response, instead staring straight ahead, refusing to show fear despite the terror churning inside her. The guard laughed and left, locking the door behind him. Alone in the growing darkness, Ruby tested her bonds. The ropes were expertly tied, with no give or slack that she could exploit. Her wrists, still tender from her previous captivity, burned where the hemp rubbed against them. "Think, Ruby," she told herself. "There must be some way out of this." But as the minutes stretched into hours and the last light faded from the cracks in the boarded windows, no solution presented itself. Ruby was left alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the horrible knowledge that Mason was riding into a trap because of her. Outside, she could hear Blackwell's men moving about, making preparations. Occasionally, snippets of conversation would reach her, mentions of positions, ambush points, how many men to station where. They were thorough in their planning, leaving nothing to chance. Ruby's only hope lay in Mason's caution and experience. Perhaps he would sense the trap, approach with reinforcements, or find some way to turn the tables on Blackwell. But she knew, with a sinking certainty, that Mason would come for her regardless of the risk to himself. He had promised to protect her, and he was a man who kept his promises, even at the cost of his own life. The night grew cold and Ruby shivered in her thin dress. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She had not eaten since breakfast, but discomfort was the least of her concerns. Her thoughts were consumed with Mason, with the danger he was riding into, with the desperate need to warn him somehow. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, exhaustion claimed her, and Ruby drifted into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of rope and fire and Mason's blue eyes going dull as life left them. She woke to the sound of the door being unlocked. Daylight filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, suggesting it was early morning. Blackwell entered, followed by 2 of his men. His expression was one of anticipation, like a cat about to pounce on a cornered mouse. "Your marshal is on his way," he announced without preamble. "One of my men spotted him about an hour's ride from here. Alone, just as I expected. Brave but stupid." Ruby's heart sank at the confirmation of her fears. "Let me go," she pleaded. "Your quarrel is with me, not him," Blackwell laughed. "My quarrel is with anyone who interferes with my business. Mitchell has been a thorn in my side for too long." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. But don't worry. I'll let you watch him die before I take you to your new owner. Consider it a parting gift." Ruby lunged forward as much as her bonds would allow, spitting directly into Blackwell's face. It was a small, futile gesture of defiance, but it was all she had. Blackwell recoiled, wiping his face with a bandana. For a moment, rage contorted his features, and Ruby thought he might strike her. Instead, he regained control and smiled coldly. "Save that spirit for later. You'll need it." He turned to his men. "Get into position. I want everyone ready when Mitchell arrives. Remember, I want him alive long enough to know he failed." After they left, Ruby renewed her struggles against the ropes, ignoring the pain as they cut into her skin. She had to get free, had to find some way to warn Mason. But the knots held firm, and all she succeeded in doing was rubbing her wrists raw once again. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Every sound from outside made Ruby tense hoofbeats, voices, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Blackwell's men were making their final preparations for Mason's arrival. Then a new sound cut through the morning air, a single gunshot, followed by a cry of pain. Then another shot, and another. Shouting erupted outside, men calling to each other in confusion and alarm. "He's behind us." "Where did he come from?" "Cover the east side." More gunfire, more shouts. The sounds of a battle in full swing. Hope flared in Ruby's heart. Maybe Mason hadn't come alone after all. Maybe he had brought deputies, or had somehow outmaneuvered Blackwell's carefully laid trap. The door to her prison burst open, and Blackwell stormed in, his face contorted with rage. "Your Marshal's cleverer than I gave him credit for," he snarled, drawing a knife from his belt. "But it won't save either of you." He crossed to Ruby and cut the ropes binding her to the chair, but left her wrists tied. Grabbing her by the arm, he hauled her to her feet. "You're coming with me. If I can't have Mitchell in my trap, I'll make him come to me." Blackwell dragged Ruby outside into the chaos of the mining camp. Men ran in all directions, taking cover behind buildings and firing at unseen targets in the surrounding hills. Two of Blackwell's gang already lay motionless in the dirt. "Mitchell," Blackwell bellowed, pulling Ruby in front of him and pressing his knife to her throat. "Show yourself, or she dies here and now." The gunfire ceased. An eerie silence fell over the camp, broken only by the moans of a wounded man and the restless shifting of horses tied nearby. "Let her go, Blackwell." Mason's voice came from somewhere to their left, calm and steady despite the circumstances. "This is between you and me." "Show yourself first," Blackwell demanded, the knife pressing harder against Ruby's skin. She felt a warm trickle of blood where the blade had broken the surface. "I'm right here." Mason stepped out from behind one of the cabins, his revolver held at his side. He looked tired but alert, his blue eyes taking in the scene with calculating precision. Ruby noticed with horror that his left sleeve was darkened with blood. "You're hurt," she said, her voice catching. "I'm fine," Mason replied, his gaze never leaving Blackwell. "Are you all right?" "She won't be if you don't drop that gun," Blackwell threatened, twisting Ruby's arm painfully behind her back. Mason hesitated, then slowly placed his revolver on the ground. "There, now let her go," Blackwell laughed. "I don't think so. She's my insurance that you'll behave yourself." He backed up, dragging Ruby with him toward the horses. "Here's what's going to happen, Marshal. My men and I are going to ride out of here with the lady. You're going to stay right where you are until we're gone. If you follow us, she dies. Simple enough." "You know I can't let you take her," Mason said, his voice deceptively calm. "You don't have a choice." Blackwell had reached the horses now, his men covering his retreat with their weapons. "Say goodbye to your martial teacher. You won't be seeing him again." "Mason," Ruby called, her eyes locked with his across the distance between them. Something in his expression, a slight nod. A silent communication told her to be ready. "Now, halt!" Mason suddenly shouted. A shot rang out from the hillside above the camp. Blackwell jerked backward, the knife falling away from Ruby's throat as he staggered. Ruby didn't waste the opportunity. She drove her elbow back into Blackwell's stomach with all her strength, then twisted free of his grasp. "Run!" Mason yelled, diving for his discarded revolver. Ruby ran toward Mason as gunfire erupted around them. One of Blackwell's men moved to intercept her, but a shot from the hillside dropped him before he could reach her. Mason fired twice in quick succession, providing cover as Ruby sprinted across the open ground between them. She was almost to safety when Blackwell's voice rang out behind her. "Mitchell?" Ruby turned to see Blackwell, blood staining his shirt from a wound in his shoulder, leveling a revolver not at Mason but at her. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger. A body slammed into hers, knocking her to the ground as the shot rang out. Mason. He had thrown himself between her and the bullet. "No!" Ruby cried as they fell together, Mason's weight partially cushioning her impact with the hard earth. Another shot echoed from the hillside, and Blackwell fell backward, a red stain blossoming on his chest. The remaining members of his gang, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons or fled into the surrounding wilderness. "Mason!" Ruby struggled to turn beneath him, terrified that he had been killed saving her. "Mason, please!" He groaned and rolled onto his side, clutching his right shoulder. "I'm all right," he managed through gritted teeth. "Just grazed me." Relief flooded through Ruby as she saw that the wound, while bleeding freely, was indeed just a graze along his upper arm. Blackwell's shot had missed its lethal mark thanks to Mason's quick action. Men began descending from the hillsides. Mason's deputies, at least half a dozen of them. They quickly secured the surviving members of Blackwell's gang and checked on those who had fallen. Deputy Wilson approached, kneeling beside Mason. "Marshal, you all right?" "Been better," Mason grunted, allowing Wilson to help him sit up. "Blackwell, dead, sir. Took my shot when I had it, just like you said." Mason nodded, then turned to Ruby, his eyes filled with concern despite his own injuries. "Let me see your wrists." Even now, bleeding from 2 separate wounds, his first thought was for her. Ruby felt something swell in her chest, a feeling too powerful to name. "Your shoulder needs attention first," she insisted. "The lady's right, Marshal," Wilson said, already pulling bandages from his saddlebag. "Let me patch you up before you bleed all over her." While Wilson tended to Mason's wounds, another deputy cut the ropes from Ruby's wrists. The skin beneath was raw and bleeding in places, the newly healed tissue torn open once more by Blackwell's rough treatment. "We'll get you both to Doc Harris in town," Wilson said as he finished bandaging Mason's shoulder and arm. "These need proper cleaning and stitching." "Blackwell mentioned a buyer," Mason said, his voice stronger now. "Someone in Humboldt who was paying for women. I want that man found." "Already working on it, Marshal," Wilson assured him. "Mrs. Finch had a suspicion it might be Edwin Prescott. You know, that businessman who moved in last year. We found some interesting paperwork in his office this morning while he was conveniently out of town." Mason's expression hardened. "Bring him in when he returns. I want him to face justice for his part in this." The ride back to Humboldt was slow and careful, mindful of the injuries Mason and Ruby had sustained. They rode double on Mason's horse, Ruby seated before him, his good arm wrapped securely around her waist. The physical closeness was a comfort after the terrors of the previous day. "How did you know?" Ruby asked as they rode. "About Blackwell's trap." "I didn't, not at first," Mason admitted. "But when the livery stable fire broke out, it seemed too convenient. And then one of the townspeople mentioned seeing strangers leaving in a hurry just before the fire was discovered." He paused. When I got back to the cabin and found you gone, I knew exactly what had happened. But how did you find me? They were so careful to hide their trail. A smile touched Mason's lips. Not careful enough, and I had helped Deputy Wilson was a tracker before he became a lawman. Besides, I would have turned over every rock in Nevada to find you. The simple declaration, spoken matter-of-factly, sent warmth spreading through Ruby's chest. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming for me. Again." "I made you a promise," Mason replied, his voice low near her ear. "No more ropes on your wrists. Not while I'm alive." In town, Doc Harris tended to their injuries with gruff efficiency. Mason's shoulder wound required several stitches, as did the earlier wound on his arm. Ruby's wrists were cleaned, treated with an antiseptic salve, and carefully bandaged once more. "Keep these clean and dry," the doctor instructed her. "And no more getting yourself kidnapped for at least a month, young lady. These wrists need time to heal properly." Ruby managed a smile at the attempted humor. "I'll do my best, doctor." Mrs. Finch insisted they both stay at her boarding house while they recovered, setting aside her best room for Ruby and another for Mason. The other boarders had not yet returned after the excitement of the previous days, so they had the place largely to themselves. That evening, after a hearty meal prepared by Mrs. Finch, Ruby and Mason sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Despite the bandages on her wrists and the lingering fear from her ordeal, Ruby felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before the stagecoach robbery. "What will you do now?" Mason asked after they had sat in comfortable silence for some time. Ruby considered the question. Her original plan seemed distant now, part of another life. "I don't know," she admitted. "The teaching position in San Francisco is surely filled by now. And I'm not sure I want to go there anymore. Because of what happened, partly." Ruby looked out at the town of Humboldt, at the people going about their evening business. In just a short time, this place had come to mean something to her, not just as the site of her trauma, but as the place where she had found unexpected strength, unexpected connections. But also because there's something about this place, something real and honest, despite everything. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Humboldt could use a good teacher. Our current schoolmaster is planning to retire come winter." Ruby turned to look at him, surprised by the suggestion. "You think I should stay here?" "I think you should do what feels right for you," Mason said carefully. "But I know the town would be lucky to have you." The unspoken question hung between them, would you stay for me? Neither quite ready to voice it aloud. "And my father's property in San Francisco," Ruby mused. "I should at least see it, decide what to do with it." "Of course," Mason agreed. "I could accompany you there if you'd like. Once we're both healed up, make sure you arrive safely this time." Ruby smiled at the offer. "I'd like that very much." Their eyes met, and that same tension, that same possibility that had flared between them at the cabin, returned stronger than before. Mason reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand, careful of her bandaged wrist. "Ruby," he said, his voice lower, more intimate than she had heard it before. "I know this isn't the right time with everything you've been through, but I need you to know that I've come to care for you, more than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." Ruby's heart soared at the confession, at the vulnerability in this strong man's eyes as he laid his feelings bare for her. "I care for you too, Mason," she said softly. "And I don't think there's anything inappropriate about it, despite the circumstances. You saved my life. More than that, you saved my faith in humanity." The smile that spread across Mason's face transformed his usually serious features, making him look younger, almost boyish in his happiness. "Does that mean you'll consider staying, at least for a while. I'll consider it, Ruby promised, returning his smile. But first, I think I'd like to see that property in San Francisco, make peace with my father's legacy, then decide where my future lies. Mason nodded, understanding her need for closure before making any decisions. When you're ready to go, I'll be ready to accompany you. They sat together as darkness fell, hand in hand, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Nevada sky. Ruby knew there were still challenges ahead, healing from her trauma, deciding her future, navigating this newfound connection with Mason. But for the first time since the stagecoach robbery, she felt truly hopeful. 3 weeks later, Ruby stood on the platform of the Humboldt train station, a carpet bag containing her few possessions at her feet. Mason stood beside her, fully recovered from his wounds and dressed in his best suit for the journey. The morning train to San Francisco would be arriving shortly. "Are you sure about this?" Ruby asked, not for the first time. "You're needed here. The town will manage without me for a few weeks," Mason interrupted gently. "Deputy Wilson is perfectly capable of handling things in my absence." He took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them in the weeks of recovery. "Besides, I made you a promise." Ruby smiled, squeezing his hand. The rope burns on her wrists had finally healed, leaving only faint pink scars that would fade with time. Other wounds, less visible but deeper, were healing too, though more slowly. The past weeks had been a time of recovery and decision-making. Ruby had written to the school in San Francisco, explaining her delay and the circumstances behind it. Their response had been sympathetic, but regretful the position had indeed been filled. However, they suggested she visit anyway, as other opportunities might arise. Ruby had also made inquiries about her father's property through the bank in San Francisco. The responses confirmed that the deed remained in her name, the small house and land waiting for her to claim them. Mrs. Finch approached, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "For the journey," she said, handing it to Ruby. "Sandwiches, fruit, and some of those ginger cookies you like." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch, for everything." Ruby embraced the older woman who had become something of a surrogate mother during her time in Humboldt. "Take care of each other," Mrs. Finch said, looking between Ruby and Mason with knowing eyes. "And don't be strangers when you return. When not if." The word choice wasn't lost on Ruby. The train whistle sounded in the distance, announcing its approach. Mason picked up Ruby's carpetbag and his own small valise. "Ready." Ruby looked around at the town of Humboldt, at the dusty streets and wooden buildings, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the faces of people who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. It wasn't Boston, with its cultured society and familiar comforts. It wasn't San Francisco, with its promise of new opportunities and adventures. But it had become something significant to her nonetheless. "I'm ready," she said, turning back to Mason with a smile. The train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and the squeal of brakes. They boarded, found their seats, and settled in for the journey westward. As the train pulled away from Humboldt, Ruby watched the town recede through the window, Mason's steady presence beside her a comfort and a promise. "It's strange," she mused as the last buildings of Humboldt disappeared from view. "A month ago I was on another journey to San Francisco. Everything was different then." "You were different," Mason observed. "So was I." Ruby nodded, thinking of how much had changed in so short a time. She had come to Nevada a sheltered Boston schoolteacher, naive and unprepared for the hardships of the frontier. She would return to Humboldt if she chose to return as a woman who had faced the worst humanity had to offer and survived, who had found strength she never knew she possessed. The journey to San Francisco passed without incident. a stark contrast to Ruby's previous attempt. They arrived on a foggy morning, the famous city shrouded in mist that softened its edges and muted its sounds. Mason arranged for a hired carriage to take them to the address, indicated in Ruby's father's papers, a small house on a quiet street at the edge of the growing city. As they approached, Ruby felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. This was her inheritance, her father's final gift to her. What would she find there? The house was modest but well built, with a small garden in front and fruit trees visible in the back. It stood on a slight rise, affording a view of the bay in the distance when the fog cleared. As Ruby and Mason walked up the path to the front door, an elderly man emerged from the neighboring house. "You must be Robert's daughter," he called, approaching with a smile. "We've been expecting you for some time now." "Yes, I'm Ruby Taylor," she confirmed, surprised to be recognized. "You knew my father. Robert and I were colleagues at the university for many years. I'm Professor James Henderson." He shook Ruby's hand, then Mason's. "Your father bought this place as a retirement home, though he never got to enjoy it himself, poor fellow. He told me his daughter would be coming to claim it someday." "It's lovely," Ruby said, looking back at the house. "Exactly the kind of place my father would have chosen." "The house has been kept in good order," Professor Henderson assured her. "My wife and I have looked after it, aired it out regularly. Everything inside is as your father left it." He produced a key from his pocket and handed it to Ruby. "He entrusted this to me to give to you when you arrived, said you'd know what to do with the place." Ruby accepted the key, emotion welling in her throat at this tangible connection to her father. "Thank you for keeping it safe. Will you be staying?" the professor asked. "The university would be fortunate to have Robert Taylor's daughter among its faculty." "I could arrange an introduction if you'd like." "That's very kind," Ruby said, "but I haven't decided my plans yet. We're just here to see the property and—" She glanced at Mason, who stood quietly supportive beside her. "And consider our options." Professor Henderson's eyes twinkled as they moved between Ruby and Mason. "I see. Well, take your time. The house is yours to live in or sell as you choose." After he had gone, Ruby stood before the door, the key heavy in her hand. This was the culmination of the journey she had begun over a month ago, the destination she had been seeking when fate had intervened so violently. "Would you like to go in alone?" Mason asked, sensitive to the emotional significance of the moment. Ruby shook her head. "No, I'd like you with me." The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a cozy interior filled with furnishings that were unmistakably her father's: the large bookcase dominating one wall, the comfortable armchair beside the window, the writing desk with its neat stacks of papers and books. "Oh," Ruby breathed, stepping inside. "It's as if he just stepped out for a moment." Mason followed, closing the door quietly behind them. He remained silent, allowing Ruby to absorb the surroundings at her own pace, to confront the memories and emotions that the space evoked. Ruby moved through the rooms slowly: the parlor with its piano. Her mother had played. The small dining room with the oak table she remembered from childhood. The kitchen with its modern conveniences that her father had been so proud to provide for her mother. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms, one clearly meant to be her father's study, another prepared as a guest room, and the third. The third bedroom had been decorated for a younger woman, with a delicate dressing table, a bookshelf filled with volumes Ruby recognized from her own collection in Boston, and a quilt on the bed that had been made by her grandmother. Her father had prepared this room for her, hoping she would visit, perhaps even stay. "He wanted me to come here," Ruby said, emotion making her voice thick. "He planned for it, hoped for it." Mason stood in the doorway, watching her with understanding in his eyes. "It's a beautiful home." A wonderful gift. Yes, Ruby agreed, running her hand along the smooth wood of the dressing table. But I don't know if I can stay here, surrounded by these memories. It would be like living with ghosts. They spent the day exploring the house and its surroundings. The back garden was larger than it had appeared, with apple and pear trees, a vegetable patch gone slightly wild in the absence of tending, and a small stable that could house 2 horses. It was, Ruby had to admit, a perfect property, neither too large nor too small, close enough to the city for convenience but removed enough for peace and privacy. That evening they sat on the porch, watching the fog roll in from the bay. Ruby had found a bottle of her father's favorite whiskey in a cabinet, and she and Mason shared a drink as the day faded into night. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked after they had sat in comfortable silence for some time. Ruby considered the question, her thoughts a complex tangle of past, present, and possible futures. "I'm thinking that my father loved this place. He saw a future here for himself, maybe for me too." She took a sip of whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "But I'm not sure it's my future anymore." Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what do you see as your future now?" Ruby turned to look at him. This man who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness and respect when others had treated her as property, who had risked everything to protect her. In the weeks of their acquaintance, something profound had grown between them, something that transcended gratitude or obligation. "I see possibilities," she said softly. "Different from what I imagined before, but no less valuable for that." Mason set down his glass and took her hand, his touch gentle on the scars that marked her wrist. "Ruby, I don't want to pressure you. Your life has been upended in ways most people couldn't imagine. You deserve time to heal, to decide what you truly want." "I know what I don't want," Ruby said firmly. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I don't want to let what happened define the rest of my life." She met his gaze steadily. "And I don't want to lose what we've found together, whatever it may be." The expression that crossed Mason's face was one of such tenderness that it took Ruby's breath away. "I don't want to lose it either," he said, his voice low and earnest. "When I thought Blackwell had taken you forever, when I thought I might be too late." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I realized then how much you had come to mean to me in such a short time." Ruby felt her heart swell with emotion. "We barely know each other," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I know enough," Mason replied, echoing what he had said to Mrs. Finch weeks ago. "I know you're brave and resilient. I know you have a quick mind and a kind heart. I know that when you read by the fire, you twist a strand of hair around your finger without realizing it. And I know that I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." Ruby's eyes filled with tears at the simple, heartfelt declaration. "Mason, I'm not asking for promises," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know, whatever you decide about this place, about your future, I'll support you. And if there's any chance that future might include me." He trailed off, vulnerability plain in his expression. Ruby raised her free hand to his face, gently tracing the line of his jaw. "There's every chance," she whispered. "More than a chance." Mason leaned forward, his eyes seeking permission, and Ruby met him halfway. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened with the intensity of feelings too long restrained. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Ruby felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "I think I could be happy here," she said, looking around at the house, the garden, the view of the bay beyond. "But I think I could be happier in Humboldt with you." The smile that spread across Mason's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You mean that?" Ruby nodded. "The school needs a teacher. I need a purpose. And we—" she smiled, squeezing his hand. We deserve a chance to see where this leads without the shadow of danger hanging over us." "What about this place?" Mason asked, gesturing to the house. "We could keep it," Ruby suggested. "Visit sometimes, or perhaps rent it out. The income would be useful, especially on a teacher's salary." She paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you'd prefer to live here." "I don't want to assume my place is in Humboldt," Mason said without hesitation. "My work, my purpose is there." His eyes held hers. "And now, it seems, my heart as well." They stayed in San Francisco for 2 weeks, making arrangements for the house. They decided to rent it to a young professor and his wife, with Professor Henderson overseeing the agreement and exploring the city together. Ruby visited the school that had initially offered her a position, explaining her situation and her decision to accept a teaching post in Humboldt instead. "That's a shame for us," the headmistress said, "but I understand the appeal of building something in a frontier town. And of course, there are other considerations." She smiled knowingly, having met Mason when he accompanied Ruby to the school. On their last evening in San Francisco, Mason took Ruby to dinner at one of the city's finest restaurants. He seemed uncharacteristically nervous, adjusting his tie repeatedly and checking his pocket with a frequency that piqued Ruby's curiosity. "Is something wrong?" she asked as they waited for their dessert. "Wrong? No, nothing's wrong." Mason took a deep breath, then reached across the table to take her hand. "Ruby, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything that led to our meeting. I know it's soon, perhaps too soon, but I've never been more certain of anything." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a single diamond. "I can't offer you the comforts of Boston or the excitement of San Francisco, but I can offer you my heart, my protection, and my promise to cherish you for all our days." His blue eyes, usually so steady, now held a question and a vulnerability that touched Ruby deeply. "Ruby Taylor, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Ruby felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. She had known somehow that this moment was coming, had felt it building between them with each day they spent together. Yet the reality of it, the tangible proof of Mason's love and commitment, overwhelmed her. "Yes," she said, her voice catching with emotion. "Yes, Mason, I will." The joy that illuminated his face was everything Ruby could have hoped for. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and raised her hand to his lips, kissing it tenderly. "I promise you," he said, his voice low and fervent, "no more rope burns, no more fear. Just love and protection, for as long as I live." "And I promise you," Ruby replied, "that the woman you saved that day on the auction block will spend the rest of her life being worthy of your sacrifice, your love." They returned to Humboldt as an engaged couple, much to Mrs. Finch's delight. "I knew it," she exclaimed when they shared the news, and the town's approval. The story of how Marshal Mitchell had saved Ruby from Blackwell's gang, twice risking his life for her, had become something of a local legend during their absence. The school board readily accepted Ruby's application for the teaching position, impressed by her credentials and perhaps also influenced by her connection to the respected Marshal. The retiring schoolmaster agreed to stay on until Christmas to help Ruby settle into the role. Mason insisted they wait until spring for the wedding, wanting to give Ruby time to adjust to her new life in Humboldt and to ensure she was truly certain of her decision. Ruby appreciated his consideration, but found her certainty growing rather than diminishing with each passing day. They were married in April 1877, when the desert was briefly transformed by wildflowers. The ceremony was held in Humboldt's small church, with Mrs. Finch standing in place of Ruby's mother and Deputy Wilson serving as Mason's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, which spilled from the church into the street in typical frontier fashion. As a wedding gift, the town council presented them with a deed to a piece of land not far from Mason's cabin, with funds allocated for building a proper house. Until it was completed, they would live in the cabin that had become a sanctuary for Ruby during her darkest days. Their wedding night was everything Ruby had dreamed it might be: tender, passionate, and filled with the deep connection they had forged through hardship and healing. As they lay together afterward, Mason gently traced the fading scars on Ruby's wrists, a reminder of the journey that had brought them together. "I used to wonder why my father died," he said softly into the darkness. "What purpose his sacrifice served, beyond the immediate saving of one man's life. Now I think perhaps it was to show me the kind of man I should strive to be, the kind of man who would one day be worthy of you." Ruby turned in his arms, pressing a kiss to his chest above his heart. "You are worthy, Mason Mitchell, more than worthy. And I thank God every day for bringing you to that auction block, for giving you the courage to bid for a woman you didn't know." "Best $1,000 I ever spent," Mason murmured, drawing her closer. They fell asleep in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that the ropes and fears of the past had been replaced by bonds of love and trust that would endure for a lifetime. In the years that followed, Ruby became a beloved figure in Humboldt, known for her innovative teaching methods and her genuine care for her students. Mason continued his work as marshal, though with a new caution born of having someone precious to return to each night. Their house on the edge of town became known for its warmth and hospitality, a gathering place for friends and a sanctuary for those in need. Ruby never forgot what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be at the mercy of cruel men, and she made it her mission to help others who found themselves in similar circumstances. In 1879, Ruby gave birth to their first child, a son they named Robert, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter, Evelyn, joined the family, named for Mrs. Finch, who had become like family to them both. The children grew strong and happy, raised with stories of courage and compassion, of the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Sometimes, Ruby would look at her wrists, at the faint scars that remained as a testament to her ordeal. Rather than seeing them as reminders of trauma, she came to view them as marks of survival, of the journey that had led her to a life fuller and more meaningful than she could have imagined that terrible day on the auction block. And always, there was Mason, steadfast, loving, keeping the promise he had made that first day in the sheriff's office, that as long as he lived, no one would ever put ropes on her wrists again. It was a promise he kept not just through physical protection, but through the love and security he provided, the family they built together, and the community they helped to shape. The rope burns had long since healed, but the protection Mason had sworn that day remained a shield of love that grew stronger with each passing year, binding them together in a bond that neither time nor hardship could break.